and welcome to Media7. I'm Russell Brown. The 5 nights of rioting and looting in England have shocked the nation and provoked a furious political and judicial backlash as the first cases reached court. The extraordinary events also made for engrossing media, and in this show we'll talk to a journalist who reported from the front lines. But first, Jose Barbosa looks at how it all played out.
Tonight, UK violence spreads.
Petrol bombs were thrown, vehicles and buildings set on fire, and shops were looted.
New rioting breaking out tonight in London.
As trouble seethed in England, journalists were deployed in triptych formation to cover what was an almost unprecedented situation. And they seemed to catch it all. Every window smashed, every faceless youngster piled high with nicked V-necks and trackies was recorded. What seemed to be at the heart of it was the shooting of Tottenham man Mark Duggan by police on the 4th of August. The family led a protest demanding answers. Some on the fringes of the crowd set 2 police cars on fire. From there, it escalated into this. 5 days of disorder and looting in London and other parts of England. Meanwhile, the nation turned to their TV screens for answers, which was a bit like asking someone called Chris to give the keynote speech at a convention for people named Steve.
A lot of people saying that they've seen mindless violence here tonight.
They're picking particular shops, the things that they'd like
Sports shops, for example.
Exactly.
There was no pattern to the destruction. Any shop, a target.
Organised criminality driven by gangs and gang culture.
This is sheer criminality.
This is criminality, pure and simple.
The coverage not only reflected the public's confusion, but their fear as well.
Oh my God!
Yeah.
I don't know why people do this.
So what are you going to do?
I don't know. I don't know next what will happen to me.
You can now again buy the All Blacks jersey from overseas websites.
That one there, $75. This one there, $70.
Do you believe your brand in this country has been damaged?
Local news did have its coverage of the riots though. Lisa Owen filed useful reports and both TV1 and TV3 got Skype cranking to good effect. And it was digital media that was being examined back in England. It became clear BlackBerry was the go-to organising tool for rioting teens.
As well as just sending sort of basic text messages, you can also send messages to whole groups at a time. Unlike Twitter, they're not accessed by police. And in the case of the rioters, they've been sending out group messages, maybe to hundreds, 200, 300 people, saying where police are, let's move to another area, avoid this shop. And it's something that the police have found very difficult to get a handle on.
The idea, floated by Cameron, that services like Twitter and BlackBerry Messenger could be blocked in times of emergency, was heavily debated.
Forget it's been used by journalists like myself to communicate what was happening in the riots. Would Louise mention and Lord Prescott want to impede that? Let's not forget that social media has been used too by people to clean up after the riots.
But perhaps more than anything, the ongoing coverage seemed to highlight the gulf between the poor and the young and those who were reporting on them.
And what about you? Any bad feelings at all? Have you ever thought about it at night when you've been sleeping in your bed?
No, because I'm watching my plasma that I just got. Feels like Christmas came early, so...
Black and white, boy and girl, operate in this language together. This language which is wholly false, which is a Jamaican patois that's been intruded in England.
In the aftermath, only a few things are certain. Politics.
If there is anyone who's responsible for the environment in which these young people grew up, it's you and the Labour Party.
Anger.
Is any of your kids in prison? Is any of your kids getting stopped and searched? No, they're not. So continue the riots.
Anything I ever wanted done, I would always ask Haroon to sort it out for me. Not my eldest or my daughter, but my youngest. And they killed him.
And questions too awkward to answer.
If the media are saying these are mindless thugs that are creating this situation, why are these mindless thugs? What is creating a young man born and bred in this society to grow up and become a mindless thug?
Well, that's what happened, and no journalist got closer to the action than The Guardian's Paul Lewis, who did his work with a notepad, a BlackBerry phone and a hoodie for cover. He filed from the streets, but also reported directly to the world via Twitter. And Twitter reported to him, as hundreds of readers offered their own reports and advice on what was happening.
It started for me
when I was at home, saw a huge number of police sirens heading north past my suburb of London. And then I immediately, as people do now, turned to Twitter to see what was going on, and quickly found that someone had disseminated a picture of a police car on fire. And when I saw that, I realised this was potentially a significant news story, and I just grabbed my BlackBerry and my notepad and went out to report what I saw. And then I guess the mandate for any reporter becomes, tell what you see in a calm and restrained manner, and most importantly, really get it right, make sure it's accurate.
Were there perils in that as well? You referred to the skirmish in Enfield, and that was widely interpreted as being a major racial conflict. Is it sometimes difficult to convey context in 140 characters?
One part of North London, Enfield, we were travelling through there and we saw a large group of, in excess of 70 men. They were in their 30s and 40s. They were shouting out racial references and saying, and we later discovered they were pursuing 2 young black teenagers. And this was something we hadn't seen at that stage, and it was concerning. And I sent that tweet out in 140 characters, and it was quickly taken up. It went viral, turned into something that it was never intended to mean, and exaggerated. And in that kind of myth of hyperbole, it's very difficult to pull back. And of course, I was simultaneously filing blog posts which were describing this incident, as a minor skirmish, and trying to dampen down some of the speculation. But once the horse has bolted, it's quite difficult to rein back. But equally, Twitter, or the Twitter sphere, has a self-regulating capacity. So what we were also able to do, and what police were doing, and what the BBC and Sky News was doing, is actually disprove things and say that reports were untrue, or references to police sirens didn't mean rioting. And there were often occasions when to be on the scene and to be able to report what we saw enabled us to dampen down speculation.
I thought that was one of the more striking things, watching that Twitter stream, was that it was two-way. You were getting quite a lot of information back.
The process of reporting through Twitter is no longer, as it was via newspapers, for example, one way. It's discursive, and you have to accept that it's a conversation, and information will emerge through that conversation. It's two-way, and that's a very different form of journalism, but actually the advantages are really quite significant. I mean, I can think of many occasions during the 5 days of reporting the riots when I would put out a question onto Twitter and say, can someone give me a postcode for the fire, for example, at the Sony distribution centre? And within half a minute, I would have maybe 15, 16 responses. A few of them would contain errors, but you could look at those 15 or 16, and if 9 of them had exactly the same postcode reference, then all you had to do was plug that into your phone, put it into the map, and you're on your way to that destination.
How did you get the BlackBerry messages that were being used to coordinate the looting?
They were using a closed network. They were using BlackBerry Messenger, which is different in the sense that it's private, and you need encrypted PIN numbers to be able to receive other people's messages and broadcasts. And it was upon the realisation of that, when we figured that actually it was BBM messaging that was being used, that we decided to set up a facility. So we created an account, we created a PIN number, put that out into the public domain, and asked people to send us the types of BBM messages that were being used to orchestrate the riots. And very quickly we had a fascinating stream of information from across the country, of messages that were being used to incite violence, to organise riots in different cities across England. And that was a really useful piece of intelligence for us. It enabled us to tell the story with more nuance, but it also enabled us to administer our reporting resources and make sure we deploy our staff in the right places at the right time.
Who made the editorial decisions on what messages to publish and when? Because obviously these were quite sensitive things, weren't they?
We took the decision quite early on that we weren't going to put out any BBM messages, which were attempts to orchestrate the rioting or the violence, before the incident had taken place. Because we didn't want to partake in that. We didn't want our reporting to be incendiary or to feed into that in any way. So our general rule of thumb was, once an incident had taken place, once the riot had occurred, then we would retrospectively look at those BBM messages and look at which of those it would be in the public interest and informative for us to publish. And there were occasions when we did that. You know, the second night of rioting, which was in North London, and really made everyone realise that this was contagion. You know, it was spreading, and it was more significant than an isolated riot. There was a message which encouraged people from all sorts of different suburbs of London to congregate in one place at one time. And we thought it was very important for us to get that message out, to show people how this was being organised and orchestrated. And for that reason, I think it was right to publish those messages.
What did you learn from this experience professionally?
I definitely, I would say, believed in the theory of, you know, crowdsourcing. You know, there is an inherent wisdom in the crowd, and it really was a collaborative process. You know, I was the journalist on the ground, feeding back information to what turned out to be, you know, in excess of 35,000 followers. But those 35,000 were also helping me in the reporting process, and I could not have done what I did were it not for the fact that there were all of these other people who were collaborating in that journalistic process.
Paul Lewis of The Guardian there. An extended version of that interview appears on the Media7 website. As we conducted it, news broke that 2 young men had been sentenced to 4 years prison for inciting others to riot via Facebook, even though their postings resulted in no actual crimes. And in a news story that might pass as satire, a 20-year-old was charged under Britain's Serious Crime Act with using BlackBerry Messenger to organise a water fight. How did this febrile climate come to be? I'm joined now by Bronwyn Hayward, a senior lecturer at the University of Canterbury, who has spent the last 3 years studying youth trends in Britain. Now, you don't seem to have been surprised at what's happened in Britain. What led you to think there was trouble ahead?
Well, it wasn't just me. I mean, the media had been speculating for about 3 months that this would be a summer of violence following cuts that the Clegg and Cameron government had introduced. So that was one of the things. And it's one of the things I find really disorientating about this reporting, is that it's all as if it suddenly happened when it had been the same sets of bylines that were saying this would happen. But I think as well as the underlying conditions that we were looking at, I think for me, when I realised how serious it was at the first of the student protests when I happened to be there. I've never seen so many police assembled. And what overwhelmed me at that first protest was that the age of the protesters was really young. And this wasn't riots, this was a straight protest. They were 12, 14. And I'd never seen that in a developed country in that way. And then what really shocked me, I think, was coming back to the office and trying to talk to people and also watching the broadcast in the evening. It was as if I hadn't been at that event, because everybody had a pre-prepared script about what it was going to be about. And they even didn't really want to know the age of the kids. And as a Kiwi there, I was just sort of overwhelmed by it.
And in Jose's track, it was quite clear that the phrase of the day was pure criminality, which might be a description. It's not an explanation, is it?
No, and I think there's several things that have happened, and it's changed very quickly. So, of course, there is pure criminality, and there's very difficult, and I think the average age is 23 of the people that are arrested in this, I think 2000 and something. So yes, there's lots of different groups, but the group that I was really following are the kind of 13 to 18-year-old.
And the other popular meme was that it was all about entitlement and rampant consumer culture. Did you see that in your research when you were there? One thing that's very interesting right now is that the first of the research that's coming back is showing that not only is this the first generation in Britain whose outcomes, life outcomes, are going to be worse than their parents, but also, interestingly, this is the first generation whose aspirations are lower than their parents. So while we might have seen a consumer generation before, this is the first generation where we're starting to see regularly people have a lower expectation of what they would like, and that's very hard for people to get their heads around, because we are thinking that we're raising a consumer generation. That's the story that we've told ourselves. But actually, when you look even at where people are rioting and what they're looting, they were low-end retail shops. And this is a community where the economy is very similar right round the world for young teens at the moment. It's an economy that
If it can generate wealth, it will, but it is not generating jobs. So we have never seen this level of unprecedented youth unemployment.
And I suppose the question has to be in that context, could it happen here?
No, I really don't think it could. And I think that the thing that we've got to think about is, why did it happen in England? And
because it didn't happen in Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland. It didn't happen in Wales, it didn't happen in Scotland, Northern Ireland. We're seeing protests right around the world as young adults are grappling with soaring youth unemployment and growing social inequality. But we're not seeing this disorder. And there are lots of difficult questions that England has to ask themselves, because this isn't the first time it's happened in England. They've had a succession of these kind of youth disorders. One of the big things that happened just before the riots broke out was a survey that got lost in the media tsunami, which shows that England really doesn't like its children. They looked at 29 countries, and of 29 countries, England came out bottom in its attitudes and its respect of its children. So one of the really important things to think about that's very difficult for England at the moment is that they have a very big generational gap, they have a very big attitudinal gap. There are lots of factors compounding this. Well, that's not to excuse 23-year-olds smashing a window to grab a plasma TV, but it's just to say this is a really complicated situation. Well, given that we have some unflattering indicators here, I hope you're right that it won't happen. Bronwyn Hayward, thank you. After the break, a literary outing.